journals, really professors live to tell you what you did wrong and how you haven't identified the limitation correctly yet. And Dr. Bostic and I talk a lot about my field of special education and how we butt heads with general education, and we identified a limitation here that they didn't address. Everybody in this was above the 30th percentile in math, which meant there wasn't a single kid with a math disability in this study, which isn't going to look a lot like the classrooms you're probably going to teach in. So, but that's just a limitation that in general nobody talks about. Like, oh, we're just not going to address that. Or in my field, we only focus on the kids with disabilities, and we don't look to really see what everybody else in the room is doing. We're just focused on our little piece, and so those are limitations, but we kind of brush them aside.
Yeah, excellent, excellent, very good. Anything that you want to add?
No, I mean, I totally agree with what John said. I mean, yeah, it's a lot of times it's really, once you do the research, you have to realize what you did not account for and be very clear. And as long as you've stated, I think it's, I mean, so the result is still the result as long as you indicate what things you accounted for and which things you didn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, a well-written research article is going to point out its own limitations. It's being honest, right? So it's being honest in the study. It's saying, look, this is what we found, but we recognize that there are some limitations. All the students were above the 30th percentile, and we can't really measure, and lay that out so that the reader recognizes that you're not claiming that this research is the be-all, end-all, and it covers everybody for all time. It was just in this particular setting with these particular students. And Nikki, you had something that you were going to say earlier about limitations also. So.
I did. Well, we talked more about like limitations of actually doing this in your classroom.
Yeah.
So we said that one would be time, because you can't just give students a game. Like, you're not going to walk in the class and say, okay, here's a game, like, learn from it. You still have to teach them the content and go through all that and give them the meaning behind it so they can apply it into a game. So now you have a lesson that could take one day when you teach it to them. Then you have another day that's just devoted to actually doing the game, and you really don't have that much time in the curriculum. So how applicable is this? Because you can't just do games the whole year. You're going to run out of time. So there's, yeah.
All right, so we talk about limitations both in terms of what it was possible to do in our classroom given the time and the setting that we have, and also in terms of conclusions that we draw later on at the end of the study. Good. Any other comments, thoughts there? Okay, good. So what we want to do is kind of build on that here. We're going to take a look at a couple of other articles in just a minute. But a few terms just to make sure that we're all kind of speaking the same language here in terms of different ways that research is conducted and different kinds of research that are done. There are sort of two different types of studies that we need to think about. And the first of it is the experimental research. And so when I think of experimental, I think of it as kind of that attempt to prove that a treatment has an impact. So I am going to try to prove that for the students in my science class, they're going to learn more deeply, learn the concepts more deeply by me starting off the unit by doing some kind of a lab experiment and then teasing out some of the details after that, as opposed to doing some of the sort of basic content first and then doing a lab later on. There's kind of a big argument that's gone on about this in the science world for a long, long time. When is the best time to do an experiment in a science classroom? Is it at the beginning to set the tone for the unit, or is it at the end once they've learned all the pieces and as a culminating activity? So I'm going to try to prove that one of those is better than the other. And so maybe I'm going to take two groups of students that are somewhat equivalent, and one group is going to do an experiment at the beginning, and the other one does the experiment at the end, and I'm going to somehow pre-test and post-test them and try to prove that one group did better than another, and try to make a research-based argument that I'm better off if I do units this way or that way. This question actually came up in my secondary methods class yesterday afternoon. Somebody said, is it ever a good idea to have students work on skills first and practice the skills for a while and then worry about why they work the way that they do later on, as opposed to starting out with why does it work and then practicing skills later? Well, don't get me started on that, right? So we had quite a conversation about it during class. But again, this is something we could experiment on. You know, we could take two different groups of students and prove that the students are somewhat alike, and we're going to try an experiment. We're going to do one thing on one group of students and one on another. And usually in an experimental study like that, we've got some random representative sample. You know, we try to make a case for that this group of students represents kind of the whole. And so I'm going to choose several different classes, maybe in a couple different schools, whatever it happens to be, and collect some data and try to make some generalized argument that, hey, when I did this, no matter whether they were from this school or this teacher or that teacher, we seem to have some consistency in terms of the results that we have. So I'm really running an experiment to try to prove that one thing works better than something else. Usually a pre-test and post-test is part of that type of study. An example could be textbook series. And so some schools will do that. You know, is this textbook better than that one? I don't know. We're going to pilot it for a year. And so we're going to take one group of students and use the book we've been using the last 3 years. We'll take another group of students and we're going to pilot some new book. And at the end of some unit or some period of time, we're going to pre- and post-test and see whether the students seem to learn things better and more deeply by using a different textbook than something else. And we run this sort of experiment over some period of time. As you've identified, any kind of an experimental research like that is going to certainly have a lot of limitations in terms of conclusions you can draw. But that's kind of the design of those type of studies, as opposed to a study that we're going to refer to as descriptive. And a descriptive study is really, its purpose is to, I hate to use the word describe and descriptive, but that's what it is. We're going to try to describe a situation, a class, a population, some deliberate sample, like your class or a person or a set of files, and you're going to study those. So maybe I'm going to say, what is it like to be a student in, you know, this person's science class? And so I'm going to do a case study of that person, and I'm going to track their experience throughout the year. What kind of things do they encounter? What do they do in the class? How do they perform? What do they think of the teaching? And I'll really focus heavily on that one person and do a case study. Or maybe I'm just really interested in all the students, like why does a student take AP Physics? Why would they ever do that? So I'm going to take this group of students that are taking AP Physics and try to figure out that population. Where do they come from? Where are they going? Why are they taking that class? What do they look like? And so I'm going to interview those students, and I'm going to observe them in the classroom and try to paint a picture of a group of students that take AP Physics when they're in high school. Whatever it happens to be, I'm not doing an experiment. I'm not trying to prove that those students are better than, not as good as, different from some other group. I'm just looking at that sample of students and saying, let's take a good hard look at them and what they look like. So, if you think about the studies that you just read, we could probably make the argument that I don't think it would be fair to say that the person that wrote that article is trying to claim that everybody should use games in their classes at all times and it'll always work for everybody, right? It's a matter of, I did this with my students and here's what happened. I found the following games, for what it's worth. It's not a big experiment, it's not a representative sample, it's not claiming it'll happen in your classroom. I'm just giving you the data and the results of what happened in my classroom. I'm trying to describe what I did in my classroom and the effect it had on my students. So I'm not necessarily pre-testing or post-testing, although I could do that. So in general, when you do this kind of descriptive research, this is an example that comes from the area of gender research, different things that you might do in a descriptive study. Instead of actually running an experiment, you might give surveys to people to find out their opinions on something or their beliefs about something. You might do a correlation of two different things. What impact is a student's amount of time that they spend, you know, doing a typical homework assignment? How well does that correlate with their grade in the class or something like that? We're trying to describe what's going on with that class. We might observe them and be taking field notes when we're in the classroom. We might analyze content that's already out there. So for example, it could be file data, looking at what those students did last year or in the past, maybe their standardized test scores or something like that. And we collect some kind of content and we take a look at it. And again, our purpose is not to compare anybody, but just to describe an individual group. Does that make sense so far? With that? Okay. So with that in mind, we think about different ways that you can conduct the research. And we put it into kind of two different categories they talked about in your book chapter. One of them is sort of the quantitative approach, which is using numbers, versus a qualitative approach, where we're using journals, interviews, video, and that sort of thing. We think of a quantitative study, we're thinking about running a correlation or collecting some kind of pre-test and post-test data and trying to prove that students significantly made gains by the way that we taught or whatever. It's all about using numbers as opposed to getting more into students being interviewed or observed or whatever. With a little bit of luck, by the way, putting those together. So that if you have a combination of qualitative and quantitative, you can make a pretty strong case that this is what the numbers showed, and when I interviewed students, we saw similar patterns in the interviews. That's called triangulating the data. We'll talk more about that later. But so studies are not necessarily only quantitative or only qualitative. Okay. So here is an example of this. Brooks, I think you'll appreciate this video.